Hello and welcome to another episode of Beyond Day Zero with me, Mark Day. This episode is a chat with Nick Saltmarsh from a company called Hodmedod. They're a UK grower of beans, pulses and grains. They're looking at foods that can be grown in the UK, things that used to be grown in the UK. They're really, over the few years of their existence, they've really done such a lot in looking at how we can future-proof our food supply. It was really good to chat about the potential the UK has for its own food supply and how we can regain our lost love for some of the foods that have fallen out of favour. We included a chat about climate change and the extremes of weather and how they are affecting arable farming and the work that Nick's company are doing. And we also looked at the importance of the provenance of our food, understanding more, being able to trace where it comes from and how vital that is. I say this every time, but I really love this one. Hope you enjoy it. Hi Nick, I guess it would be really good for you to tell us a bit about Hodmedod's, what it is you're involved in doing and how it all came about. It would be a bit of good sort of background setting if that's okay with you.
Absolutely, yeah, great. So Hodmedod is a small independent business, and we work with a network of farmers to source and process and supply a range of whole food products that are all produced from arable crops grown entirely on British farms. So we started the business, myself and my two co-founders, Josiah and William. We started Hodmedod back in 2012. And when we started, we had initially the very simple idea of just getting more British grown fava beans back into British kitchens. And this idea arose from a project that we did previously when we were working for an organisation called East Anglia Food Link. We did a project with the Transition Town Group in Norwich, who wanted us to scope out the theoretical, ideal, local, sustainable and resilient diet that might be provided from the area around the city of Norwich. So we looked at dietary requirements and we looked at the capacity of Norwich's agricultural hinterland to provide those requirements. We found that such a thing was possible in theory. From a radius of something like 50 miles around Norwich, you could quite easily supply the nutritional requirements of the city. But then we looked at looking at what that diet might comprise. We quickly realised that one of the big steps to allow this to happen would be moving some or potentially all of our protein requirements to vegetable proteins, and we'd consequently need to be producing vegetable protein in the area around Norwich. So we thought about what that vegetable protein might be, and we wondered whether it would be feasible to grow chickpeas or lentils, for example, in the East Anglian fields. And then we were suddenly struck by a realization that there were fields of fava beans, farmers generally call them field beans, all over East Anglia, and in fact across the UK more widely. And yet we weren't eating these beans. So we got really interested in what these beans were and why we weren't eating them. At first we thought they must be disgusting. You know, why would we grow a crop and not eat it if it wasn't horrible? But we got hold of some of the beans. We cooked them up and we made, I think, initially a sort of hummus-like dish out of them. They were delicious. We researched them and discovered that they used to be a really big part of our diet. Having been introduced to Britain by the first Iron Age farmers 3,000 years or more ago, they would have been a daily part of our diet right up until a few hundred years ago, and we'd have eaten them in dishes like pottage, which would have provided the majority of our protein requirements. They fell out of favour when we turned as a nation through becoming wealthier and through agricultural and food preservation improvements. We were able to eat a lot more meat and dairy. So we turned our back on the beans, and in fact they became stigmatised as the food of the poor. But they're still eaten and appreciated in other countries, particularly in the Middle East, where fava beans especially in Egypt, are the main ingredient of the national dish, ful madamas, a sort of spicy bean stew. They're also used in Egypt to make tahamiyya, the Egyptian style of falafel, instead of chickpeas. And so British farmers have continued to grow them. They're also, if we're not eating them, very nutritional for livestock. So they're grown now for livestock feed or for export to countries like Egypt, where they're still appreciated.
Okay.
So we got really interested, and we thought, let's see if we can get people eating these beans again. We did a little trial where we packed up half a ton of beans and gave them to people in little packs to try. We got amazing feedback, and consequently decided we better do something about it. So we launched Hodmedod to get the beans from farmers into shops and into people's kitchens, and that really proved the catalyst for working with farmers to help them produce, and then to sell a much wider range of food products from arable farms. So we quickly realised there were other pulses already being grown on British farms, as well as the fava beans. There's a fantastic variety of dried peas, the best known being marrowfat peas, but also yellow and blue peas, and the amazing Carlin pea, which is a dark brown pea with a really sort of nutty flavour and a fantastic British alternative to chickpeas. So we added those to our range, and then through our growing network of farmers, we're able to further diversify the range of crops and products to include quinoa, chia, other seeds like linseed and hemp, and some lesser known cereal grains as well, like naked barley and rare varieties of wheat, and so on. And at the same time, we started exploring things you could do with those basic ingredients, milling them for flour, fermenting them. And so we've built up really quite a diverse range of whole foods, as I say, all fundamentally based on these crops from fantastic British farmers.
That's amazing. It's amazing background. Thank you for that. It's really, really interesting. There are so many things to talk about in amongst that, and I'm sure that's the sort of business that you're in. Those conversations must be part of your kind of outreach and the way that you connect with farmers and the communities around you, and as part of a wider audience. And it's amazing, isn't it, that one thing that really strikes me in amongst that is that we've, through, I guess, what feels to me like other influences, we've just got out of the habit of like eating what can be provided within this country. I'm not going to say without effort, because I'm sure we'll get onto the fact that sometimes it is a lot, there are challenges involved in doing that. But,
yes. Yeah, I mean, I think what's happened really over the last 50 years or even more is that the food we eat, the choice available to us has become apparently wider and wider, while in reality becoming narrower and narrower. So the vast majority of our nutritional and particularly calorific intake comes from a tiny number of plant and animal species. And there's this much wider diversity that doesn't really get a look in, and the choice that the supermarkets in particular present to us is often a choice of many brands of similar products, without really offering us true diversity, both in terms of what the foods are that we're able to buy and to eat, but also in terms of their provenance, where they come from, how much we know about where they come from, rather than just being sort of ultra processed, often ingredient foods made from ingredients that come through the sort of commodity supply chain. And we're just trying to demonstrate that there is another way, there is a different way of doing things that's possible.
Yeah, and is that something that is how effective is it? How much has it grown in the years that you've been doing it, and how does it feel things are now, I guess, compared to where you were and compared to where you want to be at this point?
Yeah, so a lot has changed in the last 10 years. I mean, when we started, the mention of pulses or beans or peas often met with looks of disgust from people. They had a really bad reputation. They were sort of seen as dusty, fusty ingredients and eaten by hippies, and
yeah,
otherwise people would just sort of crack the inevitable jokes about wind, and
yeah,
they weren't seen as an exciting ingredient. And I think that's really changed, obviously, with the rise of veganism and more sort of widely flexitarianism and more interest in plant-based foods. People have realized that pulse is actually a really exciting, versatile ingredient, and chefs like Ottolenghi have done a lot to promote the sort of cooking that can really make the most of those sorts of ingredients. So that's really changed. We've obviously changed and grown as well as a business. When we started off, we were minuscule. We're still a small, very small business. A very small player in the context of the sort of national food supply. But we've gone from handling just a few tons of product in our first year to several hundreds of tons a year now. So we've significantly increased the amount of crops that we're able to buy from farmers and process and get out into people to eat and enjoy. But there's a long way to go to make a real change in the food system, and we hope to do that both by doing more ourselves, being able to work with more farmers and more product, but also by demonstrating and inspiring that other things are possible. And alongside what we've been doing over the last 10 years, there has been a growth in the sort of alternative and local food sector, particularly when it comes to arable crops. And there are more and more farmers growing grains and selling them locally to their local mills, and the mills then selling that flour into local bakers. And that's something that was barely happening at all 10 years ago, and yet now is more and more widespread. There's been a quiet and so far small but growing revolution in that respect.
There must be a lot of work going on in the background to identify suitable beans, grains, pulses that can grow at under the various prevailing conditions that we have in the UK. So is this happening across the country? Is it geographically limited? I guess the work that you're doing is one where your focus is. Obviously you'll know the farms that you're working with, but is it more, in terms of it being more widespread, how far across the country is this sort of thing happening now? I mean, I guess what makes me ask that question is, I live in Derbyshire, and around here it's kind of declining sheep farming country, and I can't off the top of my head put my finger on somewhere nearby where that sort of product is being grown. So I just wonder what your opinion is about that, what you know about how widespread it is.
Yeah, so we're based in Suffolk, but we do work with farmers across the country, and often the limiting factor on doing these things locally is the processing infrastructure. So arable crops need cleaning after they're harvested. They're harvested by combine typically, but they have to be cleaned because the combines inevitably pick up other bits of the crop and stones and mud balls from the field and so on. So the crops need cleaning, and that is, for the most part, a process that is only done at the moment on quite a large scale. There are a few sort of medium scale processors, and there are people now looking at getting some smaller scale processing in place, but that is a limiting factor. So our pulses, for example, are almost all processed at one site in Lincolnshire. So in terms of where our farmers are, the product almost always has to go to Lincolnshire to be cleaned and then come back to us. And consequently, it makes sense for us to work with farmers across the country who are best placed in terms of their soil or their sort of more local climate and so on to grow the crops that we need. And an example would be fava beans, where our fava beans now are all grown in Yorkshire or Northumberland, because further south there is a pest called the Bruchid beetle that came into the country about 15 years ago or so, and attacks the fava beans in the field, and is very difficult to control. We always favour organic production, or we do work with non-organic farmers as well. But certainly with organic production, you don't have much to counter the bruchid beetle with. But if you go further north, the bruchid beetle hasn't reached that far. So we can work with farmers up there who are able to grow beans without damage from these pests. So we work with farmers across the country, and I think there are other initiatives springing up around the country. Certainly the sort of local grain milling that I talked about is happening. There's a very active network in the southwest of England, also in the Midlands. There's sort of small localized networks springing up all over the place, and doing really exciting things, connecting farmers with millers and bakers and shops, and ultimately the people who eat the food they grow.
Yeah, so the limiting factor isn't necessarily geography. It's funny because I guess I felt like that might be the case, that it was perhaps a climate thing. And obviously you touched on climate issue there with the beetle that you mentioned, and it's how it affects crops further south. But I guess I assumed that it was probably the southern Britain where we had a slightly warmer climate that was more suitable. But so that's not necessarily the case.
Not necessarily. And in fact, as I said, for the fava bean, further north is better. Obviously, to grow these crops, you need arable land rather than hill. Derbyshire is never going to be a big producer of arable crops, but other places, on the same sort of level as Derbyshire, or even further north, like Yorkshire and Northumberland have, and even Scotland has some fantastic arable land, and climate that differs, but in some cases can even be beneficial. The very long daylight hours up in Scotland during the summer can be really good for arable crops. The lower rainfall that we get in the east of England is good for some crops, probably more so than it being probably more of a benefit than it being slightly warmer further south. So the different climatic conditions are definitely important, but there's scope to grow a lot of very diverse crops right across the UK.
And are there lots of trials going on then with regards to new or even old varieties of things?
Yes, so the first products that we worked with, the fava bean and then the dried peas, those are crops that are really thoroughly established in British farming and will grow all the way across the UK. They're very well adapted to, having been grown here for thousands of years. They're very well adapted to our climate. Carlin peas, which I mentioned earlier, for example, are especially associated with a couple of regions in the north of England, with Lancashire and Yorkshire, where they are traditionally eaten in Lancashire, served at the flag market as a street food in Preston, and in Yorkshire traditionally eaten on Carlin Sunday. So there are these sort of regional traditions of growing some of these crops, and although the British food culture, the historic British food culture, is to a great extent been stamped out, there are still a few remnants, like the celebrations of Carlin peas in those counties, and so those crops are very well established. Cereals as well. Some of the older varieties of cereal, like Emma and einkorn and naked barley, and older wheat varieties, they will also grow very well across the UK. And there are varieties that, even if haven't been widely grown here in recent times, have certainly grown well in this country in the past. So very ready to be reintroduced. Other crops like pulses such as chickpeas and lentils, and other seeds like quinoa and chia, are newer to our farming. It seems that lentils were grown in the UK in the past, but then completely sort of dropped out of our traditions. But those others, chickpeas and quinoa and chia, really haven't been grown here until people started dabbling with them maybe a couple of decades ago, and have either only recently come into sort of significant production, or in the case of chickpeas, we're still working through trials to really identify the best varieties that will grow reliably in our climate.
Yeah, and I've seen some of your stories, photos on social media in the last. Is it the chickpea trials that you've been doing, or farmers have been doing, whether it's yourselves directly or not, I'm not sure. In the last couple of years of chickpeas, where you've had to contend with extremes of weather while those trials have been going on.
Yes, right? Yeah. So lentils we started trialing probably about 7 or 8 years ago now, and we've got now into quite regular, reliable production. Chickpeas we started working with a farmer 3 years ago on trials. The first year went really pretty well, but then in the second year, which was last year, the weather just threw challenges at the chickpeas. Spanish farmers apparently say that chickpeas should see water twice in their lifetime, at their birth and at their death.
Right.
The birth is when you sow the chickpeas in the field and a little bit of rain helps to get them started. Their death is when you cook the chickpeas in a pot of boiling water.
And never between the two.
And in between, they don't really like too much water. So when you get a month's worth of rain in a day, just as they're maturing in August, it's quite a challenge. And that's in fact, what is pretty much the driest part of the United Kingdom, the Brecks, which is an area sort of on the border of Suffolk and Norfolk, which is very sandy land, very dry, almost like a desert in some ways, but so should be really well suited to growing chickpeas. But then, with climate change, we're experiencing ever more extreme weather. So there have been these terrible deluges last year, which really presented a big challenge to the chickpea crop. And this year hasn't been so bad yet, but it's not been the easiest year. So chickpeas are still very much a work in progress. We're
so you pick
the growing methods and different varieties to try and find a way of making them work.
Yeah, and you start off and you find an area that should be perfect, nice and dry, not much rainfall.
Yeah,
and then that happens.
We live in a maritime climate, so we have to always expect a certain amount of unpredictable weather, but it clearly is getting worse, and that's clearly the effect of climate change, that we just have more extremes, and that can be terrible deluges of rain, but also periods of drought. And we seem to recently have been sort of veering from one extreme to the other, which just not just for chickpeas but for other crops is a stress. If the crops go from a lack of water to an excess, it's not ideal.
Yeah, we seem to, I guess it varies a little bit across the country, and it's like even this year, I guess must be so far have been a challenge as well, because we had a very cold spring, and then here we've had, in fact, it rained last night and into this morning, and that's the first. Okay, May was wet, and then we've had almost a month. Well, yeah, pretty much a month where it's been dry and probably warmer than average. And it does just seem like, and that was the pattern, although not quite at the same time for us here last year.
Mm.
We had a long, dry, warm spring. And then it doesn't seem like we're experiencing the same sort of traditional maritime patterns. It seems a bit more jumping from one extreme to the other.
It absolutely is, yeah. I mean, that's definitely what we're seeing, and the lack of a sort of regular pattern that we used to expect is becoming a new pattern.
Yeah, yeah. And I guess is part of identifying the crops that will work well now, sort of trying to future-proof food supply.
It is. I mean, so I said at the beginning how our sort of origins lay in identifying this potential diet for Norwich, and one of the key factors that we were asked to identify for that was it being a resilient diet. And I think that resilience is something that has been lacking in our approach to food production. We've maybe taken too much for granted. We've assumed that we can just grow the food we need, and as consumers, we can buy the food we need in the supermarket, and that will just it will always what we need will always be there, and we don't need to worry about building resilience into the system. And that narrowing of choice and that concentration of our nutritional requirements being met by a very limited number of species is eroding resilience, because we are, well, to coin a phrase, we're putting all our eggs in one basket, or in a few baskets. We're relying on a very few crops, and we're also relying on a very sort of limited food supply system, and it potentially wouldn't take much to disrupt that. And in fact, I think we saw that being tested, the food system being tested at the start of the first lockdown last year, when suddenly people weren't finding what they needed in the supermarket. The supermarket systems rely on just-in-time deliveries, and it doesn't take much to disrupt that. So and a little bit of panic buying and a bit of disruption to supply and the way we were able to sort of work and live, sort of threw all that into disarray. And there was a brief period where people were really having to look at alternatives to find their food. So that, I think, was just an insight into the lack of resilience. And part of what we believe is that the more diversity you can bring into the food system, the more resilient it's going to be. Because if you have a truly diverse system, both in terms of what we're eating, our diet being diverse and the crops we grow being diverse, but also in terms of the businesses and enterprises involved in that food system being diverse. If you have plenty of diversity, if any one thing fails, or if a few things fail, then it doesn't impact on the supply overall. If you're relying on a very few things for the supply of food, then if one particular thing, the wrong thing, goes awry, then it can have a big impact.
Yeah, and I think, and it sounds very much like, if we manage out the skills through a lack of diversification, if we really narrow the range of foods that we're eating, a little bit like you're saying, if we've lost the ability or lost if there are historical crops in the UK that we used to grow and don't anymore, and we've lost some of that diversity, there's a real threat of getting to a point where we really need that diversity, and not only do we not have it, but we don't know how to grow it either.
Yes, yeah. I mean, I hope that as a species we are good at learning. So there's always an opportunity to relearn things. But I think it's certainly worth rebuilding and relearning sooner rather than later, so we can bring that diversity back into the system. And I mean, I think another side of it is, as well as the resilience, is just the sustainability, where if you're to just sort of concentrate on arable farming, if you're growing a very narrow range of crops, wheat, oilseed rape, sugar beet, they be three of the really sort of big commodity crops. If a farmer is concentrating just on producing those crops, then it's putting the same pressures on the land and making the same demands of the land, and allowing the same pests to build up that very narrow range of crops. By bringing in a bit more diversity, growing a different crop is often called a break crop, but really every crop should be a break crop. You're then breaking the pattern of demand and the pattern of what pests can build up, and reducing the inputs that are needed to provide what the crops need, and to counter the pest pressures on the crops.
Yeah, and it links into, it's very much as well what you're talking about with regards to pests. It links into soil health as well, doesn't it? Like you say, inputs needed to maintain an output, because we're just, well, through bad practice, I guess, continual bad practice isn't a healthy way of managing the soil. My knowledge is very limited, though, so perhaps you could say a bit more about some of the the benefits of working with some of the crops that you do. I mean, again, it's not something I know in detail, but I think the sorts of crops that you're growing are nitrogen fixing a lot of the time, which is very good for soil.
Yes, so all the pulses are nitrogen fixing. They're all, pulses are by definition the dried seeds of leguminous plants, and all leguminous plants have this fantastic ability through a symbiosis with bacteria living in nodules on their roots. They're able to take nitrogen directly from the atmosphere and bring it back into the soil and available to the plant, both the pulse itself, but there is to some extent a legacy for crops that follow on as well. Some of that nitrogen stays in the soil. So that's significantly reducing the amount of artificial fertilizer that is needed to grow crops. Otherwise, growing a diversity of crops, helps to maintain biodiversity in the soil, just through each crop, by its nature, sort of interacting with the soil and the soil microfauna in different ways. I think the other thing that's really important is not demanding too much, not chasing yield at the expense of everything else. And that really has been the way that farming has been pushed for since the war, really, just to do everything possible to maximize yield. And that's really just pulling as much as possible from the land and putting in what's needed to allow that to happen. So the soil is drained of its sort of natural life and its vigor and its nutrients, and artificial fertilizer is added, in desperation to make up for that and provide what the plant needs. If we look for more sort of realistic yields without pushing things to an extreme, then more of a balance is possible. There's always the argument that we need to be producing as much food as possible to feed the world, but we believe that's a false argument, really. A lot of the pressure to produce yields is predicated on the way we feed the world, and the way we feed the world, or at least our part of it and other parts of it that we export to, that are generally the more affluent parts of the world, is through a lot of animal products. And because we're eating such a high proportion of animal products in our diet, we're having to produce a huge amount of plant-based food to feed those animals. Something between a third and a half of all British arable production is going to feed animals. So we're not growing arable crops to feed ourselves directly. Well, some of them feed us directly, but a lot of them are feeding the animals that then feed us, and it's a really inefficient way of feeding ourselves. And we don't necessarily have to cut all animal products from our diets, but a lot of people do choose to do that. But you don't have to go to that extreme to have a significant impact on the sustainability of what we eat, and to reduce the need for those massive yields. If we weren't feeding so many crops to animals, we wouldn't need to produce the yields to provide all of that. animal feed.
Yeah, it feels to me like a time is coming. Very well, it'd be better if it came sooner in a way, but that a time is coming where we all sort of need to take a really serious look, or we're going to have to take a really serious look at the diets that we're eating because of the challenges that we're going to face in the next few decades, and that transitioning to a much higher proportion of plant-based foods and a much lower proportion of animal products is going to be necessary.
Yeah, absolutely.
Um, I don't really. I feel like the science is pretty clear on that. That if that's going to be necessary, and it's just, I can understand, individually, the people are going to be sort of reluctant to change some of the time, but I don't quite, and I don't know how we bridge that gap, but I think we have to somehow.
Mm.
Otherwise, we're not going to meet the challenges that and the and it's probably only affecting a minority, or it's probably only going to affect a minority of people in the world right now that are living a probably typical Western lifestyle and eating a typical Western diet, which is meat and dairy heavier than
Mm.
elsewhere in the world. And there's quite a lot that, okay, it might seem like we in a Western culture might have to change quite a lot now. But I think if we have to consider the other people that we share the planet with, it's either we do as a minority or everyone has to suffer the consequences further down the line.
Yeah.
And that might be quite a stark message, but I think it's pretty clear that's a trajectory
Mm.
that we're on. And food security and soil health, they're big. They're big issues, aren't they?
They're crucial issues. I mean, they're absolutely critical, and there's only so long you can go on just sort of plastering over the problem, by sort of applying huge amounts of inputs to farmland to keep it productive. You can't do that forever. Eventually it will get pushed to the point where it just won't produce what we need. And yeah, I think we need to face up to that. I think probably on a more hopeful note,
Go on, yeah.
Part of what we've tried to do, and I think it's a much wider movement and change as well, is to demonstrate that we can get just as much enjoyment from a more plant-based diet as we get from a more traditional diet. And there are all sorts of fantastic dishes you can cook with pulses and grains and seeds that are just as delicious and exciting and nourishing, well, potentially even more nourishing than what we might eat traditionally. So I think it's important to keep in mind the positive aspects of dietary change, as well as just the sort of negative push towards it that we're avoiding. Really big problems. But yeah, it's not to suggest we don't need to be aware of the problems, but I think we need to approach dietary change with open arms and positively as well.
Yeah. I think you're absolutely right. We at home switched to a plant-based diet around 2 years ago now, and we love it.
Mm.
We don't in any way feel deprived of what we used to eat. And it's just a matter, isn't it, of I can't quite think where we sort of imbibe the messages. I mean, advertising, big companies, you sort of believe that you need certain things in your diet, and marketing people and advertisers kind of sell you a happy image of burgers from fast food takeaways because they have to make it like that. And it's almost like we believe that it's almost like we believe you can't be happy if you're not following that sort of lifestyle.
Yeah.
And it's definitely not the case.
Yeah.
We eat some really lovely food, and we've discovered new recipes and that, have now become firm family favorites, stuff that we have never eaten before. And as you were saying about some of the traditional recipes for beans and pulses and that type of food that we've perhaps lost, there's a whole there's a myriad, there's so many different things out there that you can really get into and try out that are just as tasty, if not and healthier.
No, absolutely. There was that was part of the motivation for us in being part of getting the British Dal Festival going, which was, and unfortunately because of coronavirus, it hasn't been able to happen the last 2 years. But back in 2019 and 2018, we helped to run the British Dal Festival, which was a celebration of dal and the other dal-like dishes that you find all over the world. I mean, because it's really a sort of shared global heritage. Everywhere in the world cooks pulses in their own particular way. But there are you can really see all those different ways of cooking pulses as sort of variations on what's perhaps the best known sort of global pulse dish, which is the dal of the Indian subcontinent. And we helped to start that festival in celebration of all things dal and all things pulse, and discovered that there's a real, there's a huge love for that sort of food. And when you start celebrating it, people come forward and just sort of, they love it. They love the fact that this very humble dish is suddenly being put at the center of meals and the center of being celebrated.
Yeah, and I guess you want the community aspect of that to be really a big component as well. And I suppose that's what's happened in the last couple of years. That's been really difficult to achieve, because the community aspect and sharing food and sharing recipes, even if not sharing food directly, is a wonderful thing, isn't it? And knitting our communities closer together is another thing that we really need to do.
Absolutely. I mean, I think sharing food and then sort of sharing and cross-fertilizing ideas, since the beginning of time, really, humans have traveled around and shared ideas and gathered ideas and also literally gathered ingredients and taken them elsewhere. And it's amazing how much of a sort of fertile ground that still is, where all of us can be inspired every day by the way that different cultures cook and eat, and bring little bits of that into our own cooking and eating, and just continue. I think the amazing thing about food is that its diversity is unlimited. You can learn new things to cook and bring new things into your diet every day.
Yeah, it is. It's a real community aspect to it, or at least it can be. I was going to ask you also about, you said that you are pretty organic focused, although sometimes that's not the case. Is that something that you deliberately set out to be, or does that just come along with?
Yeah, so we favour organic production, and we always seek and encourage our farmers to seek the most sort of agroecological approach to producing food. But we do take a pragmatic approach, and we recognise that different farmers are at different places on a journey, but we hope that they're all on a journey in the same direction towards more agroecological approaches in different ways, whether that's moving towards agroforestry or taking the move to organic certification, or reducing the tilling of their land, reducing their inputs. There are lots of ways in which farmers can continually move in that direction. So organic, I think, is a really useful sort of shorthand and indicator of some of the very best agroecological production, but there are fantastic farmers out there who aren't organic, and we work with them because we want to support them, and because many of them are growing crops that aren't being grown by organic farmers at the moment, and we want to be working with farmers across the most diverse range of crops possible.
Yeah, and you mentioned agroecology. So is that, if I've got that right, is that like just a kind of a blend of between food production and regenerative practices and soil health? And
yes, so it's a very broad term that sort of encompasses all the different approaches that farmers might take to farm more regeneratively. That's another quite broad term that's become quite popular recently. I mean, all of these terms can suffer from a lack of clarity and precision. In some ways they suffer from that, but in some ways that's a benefit in that they give scope for a lot of freedom. And I think the important thing is to ensure that that freedom isn't compromised by cutting corners within the lack of precision. And that's really where organic sort of stands tall, is that it does absolutely commit producers or ensure that farmers are committed to a very particular set of standards that they absolutely have to follow. So yes, we love organic farming, and we think that really is probably the best approach possible. But there are other approaches that are definitely going in the right direction, and we want to support them and help them on that journey.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. There's a couple of other things that I was going to ask you. I mean, one thing, is there anything that you have planned sort of coming up where you're going from here? Are there any sort of other big projects going on, or you've got planned in the future?
We've always probably got too many things going on. So I mean, we can never resist trying something new or developing new things. So we have, I mean, one very exciting development that we've just got up and running is our mill. We've bought a small scale mill, so we're now able to, we've previously sold flour that we've used other millers to produce, but we're now able to mill our own flour, which gives us a lot more flexibility in milling potentially very small batches of unusual and different grains, and potentially other seeds and crops as well, and also milling the flour and getting it to the customer as freshly as possible, so we can be milling very regularly smaller quantities and just making that available and providing the freshest possible flour from a wide range of different cereals. There are farmers we know who might only grow perhaps a ton or possibly less of a particular crop if they're trialing something new, or just growing a very small area. And the difficulty with small volumes is that sometimes they can be inefficient to handle or to send off to get them processed or milled. But by having the mill ourselves and being able to do that, we can be really nimble and flexible. And in fact, next week we're going to be launching the first collection of our own milled flours.
Lovely. And
one of those, for example, is a black flour. It's milled from a variety of black wheat. That's a new variety. It's been traditionally bred by an independent plant breeder and grown on a trial scale. But thanks to the mill, we're able to have taken just a few hundred kilos of that and be producing some flour from it.
Oh, excellent. I'll have a look for that myself.
Yeah. So that's coming very soon. We've got a new pulse up our sleeves as well, which is the wrinkled pea. Which is it's actually geneticists will know it, because Gregor Mendel, the sort of father of genetics, modern genetics, did a lot of his work on wrinkled peas, which are a particular family of pea species that have, as the name suggests, a very wrinkled appearance when they're dry. Dried peas can either be smooth, in which case they're like a sort of football, really, with a sort of plump, they're like a plump ball with a smooth surface, or they can be wrinkled, and the wrinkled peas are the most wrinkled of the wrinklier peas. And that they're exciting because they, as well as having a fantastic flavour, they're a dried pea, but they have an amazingly sort of fresh pea flavour that a lot of other dried peas don't have. But they also have some remarkable nutritional properties, particularly the fact that they have very high levels of resistant starch. So all peas contain a lot of starch. Some of that is normal starch, which is readily digestible, and some of it is resistant starch, which we ourselves can't digest, but are the microbes in our gut can.
Yeah.
So it's essentially a type of fibre. So by having, and the wrinkled peas have about twice as much resistant starch as normal peas. So they really are providing food for our gut flora.
Really good for gut health, yeah.
Obviously, that's something that we're increasingly aware of, is just how critical that is. I mean, we often think generally of pulses that a lot of people eat pulses for the protein, but actually probably the most beneficial thing in them for our diets is the fibre. And all pulses are amazing sources of fibre. And I think fibre is the part of our diet that is most neglected and most lacking in our modern diets. So
and that whole gut health thing and the microbiome is, I've heard several podcasts talking about it recently, and it's kind of expanded my mind, because it's a whole world that I don't know whether it was information that I guess it's relatively new science, isn't it? We're really discovering how important healthy gut microbiome is to our health in general, not just our gut health,
and even our mental health. There's increasing scientific evidence of the interplay between our sort of gut flora and our mental health, and it's clearly really important. And I think it is a very fast developing area of science, and a lot of new findings are emerging all the time. And maybe for that reason, because we just didn't appreciate the value of it, or maybe just because it was the way the food system was going, our modern diets have are pretty devoid of fibre, and fibre is the critical thing for our gut flora.
And the less diverse the foods we eat, the less diverse our gut flora is. And
absolutely,
it's fascinating, Nick. It's really fascinating. One final thing, really, I could ask you. I feel like that's like we've been chatting for almost an hour, and it's absolutely flown by. It's been really, really good. Really, really good. Thank you, Nick. What should listeners take away from this, do you think? Is there something, if they wanted to, what's the best way of supporting, like, either yourselves or companies like yourselves? Is there a direct way, or things that people should look to get involved in? What do you think would be good tips for people?
So I guess if I had to say one thing, I would say try to find out as much as possible about where your food comes from. Because I think that's a really good way into being more sure that it comes from somewhere good. Because if it doesn't come from somewhere good, then whoever sold it to you is not going to tell you that. So if you're buying food that has clear provenance, both in terms of where it's grown, who it's grown by, but also how it's produced, the clearer that provenance, that's a pretty good indication of the better the food is. And it's a big part of our motivation when we started was that the sorts of food we sell, whole foods essentially, actually were, and to a large extent still are, among the foods that lack provenance to the greatest extent. You go and buy a bag of rice, or a bag of lentils even from the supermarket or even from a whole food shop, and often you know very little about where it's come from, who's grown it, how it's been produced. And I think often we even have very little idea even of what the origins of it look like. You know, what does rice look like? What do lentils look like when they're growing? And the more we can find out about where our food comes from, the closer even if it's not necessarily the closer the geographical connection, but just the closer the sort of epistemological connection, if you like, the closer our knowledge is to the food, and also the greater the onus on the people producing it to make sure it is, good quality food grown in a really good way. So that's what we try to do. We try to, provide as much provenance as we can of where the food we sell comes from, how it's being produced, who's growing it. And there are other enterprises and businesses out there doing the same. And I'd urge everyone to, look for food that tells you where it comes from.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. It's something that we try to do, in terms of what we buy and sell in our shop. And I think it's it's one of the factors that's influenced me to start shifting towards more organic food as well, because it's so much more traceable in terms of where it comes from. And I think it also connects us with the other end of the supply chain, and it can help us start to understand some globally, at least, I guess, in the UK, we perhaps don't have some of these issues, but globally, some of the problematic conditions that people at the other end of the supply chain have to work under to supply the needs of a Western diet. And I think the more that we can connect with those people that are often invisible to us, the better, because they're just like us, And
absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, everyone, everyone who produces our food deserves a huge amount of respect, and it's often they're hidden from us, and that can get lost because we just can't see who's producing our food and what conditions they're doing that in. So knowing more about our food can only be a good thing.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's really, really important. Yeah. Thank you, Nick. Is there anything else that you wanted to get across that you haven't mentioned?
I think we seem to have covered a whole range of aspects. So I've really enjoyed our conversation. It's been great. Yeah, really good to talk about all of that.
Me too. Thank you so much for coming on. It's been brilliant. I've learned stuff, which is always good. And I really enjoyed that last hour. Yeah. Thank you for your time.
Thanks for the opportunity. Really good to talk to you.
No problem. Thank you. Cheers, Nick.
Cheers.
So do let me know what you thought of the latest episode. You can email me at beyonddayzeropodcast@gmail.com and drop us some comments. It'd be great to receive a few more of those, please. And it'd be great to receive some suggestions if you know anyone or a subject that you'd like to see featured in a future episode. Do remember to give us a rating and a review if your podcast platform or app allows you to do it. That would be great. It will help us to get the podcast to reach more people. And encourage us to do more of this. Next week's episode is a really good one. It's another one about rewilding with Derek Gow, who is and has been instrumental in bringing the beaver back to the UK's waterways. It's one not to miss, that. Okay, see you next time.